What if I told you that the most famous words in American history, we the people, were written by a guy with one leg who spent most of his time trying to seduce French countesses during the Reign of Terror? Or that the man who rode through a thunderstorm to cast a tie-breaking vote for independence died in an unmarked grave that nobody could find for 200 years? Or that America's independence was quite literally purchased by one man who then died bankrupt in debtor's prison while the government he'd saved refused to pay him back? You know, the famous founding fathers, Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, Hamilton, they got the monuments, the musicals, the FaceTime on currency. But tonight we're talking about the other guys, the ones who signed the documents, financed the war, won the battles, and then got erased from history for reasons ranging from bad timing to worse luck to the simple crime of not being flashy enough. Now get comfortable, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's talk about the people who built America and then got forgotten by it. Starting with a one-legged diplomat who wrote 3 words that changed everything. The one-legged penman who wrote, "We the people." So here's the thing about the most famous 3 words in American history. You know the ones. We the people. The opening salvo of the Constitution, the phrase that gets quoted at every naturalization ceremony, printed on tote bags, tattooed on the biceps of people who've never read past the Second Amendment. Those words, the ones that supposedly represent the collective voice of a brand new nation, were written by a guy with one leg who spent most of his diplomatic career trying to seduce French countesses while their husbands were being guillotined. His name was Gouverneur Morris. Not Governor Morris. Gouverneur. It was his actual first name, not a title, which is the kind of thing that happens when your family is so wealthy they start treating political offices like middle names. Born in 1752 to one of New York's most prominent families, Morris had everything handed to him on a silver platter. Education, connections, a guaranteed spot in whatever passed for high society in colonial America. But somewhere along the way, this privileged aristocrat decided to throw his lot in with a bunch of rabble-rousers who wanted to overthrow the British crown. Which, if you think about it, is a bit like a hedge fund manager joining Occupy Wall Street. By 1787, Morris had already done his time in the Continental Congress, helped finance the revolution, and generally made himself useful in the way that rich men with good handwriting tend to do during political upheavals. So when the Constitutional Convention rolled around in Philadelphia that summer, he showed up ready to work, and work he did. While James Madison gets all the credit as the father of the Constitution, a title Madison himself probably would have found exhausting, it was Gouverneur Morris who actually put pen to paper and wrote the final draft. You see, the convention had spent months arguing about every possible detail of how this new government should function. They debated, compromised, threatened to walk out, come back, debated some more. By September, they had a rough framework that kind of maybe held together if you squinted at it right. But it was a mess. A Frankenstein's monster of competing ideas and regional interests stitched together with the political equivalent of duct tape. Someone needed to take this disaster and make it sound like it had been planned all along. That someone was Morris. He was chosen for what they called the Committee of Style, which sounds like a panel of judges at a fashion show, but was actually the group tasked with turning the convention's scattered notes and agreements into actual readable text. And Morris, with his facility for language and his absolutely unshakable confidence in his own abilities, took that mess and transformed it into something that could almost pass for elegant. But here's where it gets interesting. The original draft didn't start with "We the people." It started with a list. We the people of the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and so on, naming each state individually. Morris looked at that and thought quite reasonably that this was both boring and problematic. What if some states didn't ratify? What if they needed to add new states later? The whole thing was about as future proof as a cassette tape. So Morris did what any good editor would do. He cut it, all of it. And in its place, he wrote three words that would outlive everyone in that sweltering Pennsylvania room. We the people, not we the states, not we the representatives, not we the wealthy white landowners, though that would have been more historically accurate. Just we the people. It was a masterstroke of political marketing before political marketing was really a thing. It made the Constitution sound like it came from the ground up, like it was the will of the masses, when in reality it was written by a bunch of men in powdered wigs who wouldn't let those masses anywhere near a polling place. And Morris did all of this while missing a leg. Oh, right. Did I mention he only had one leg? Because he only had one leg. Lost it in a carriage accident when he was 28 years old, which is exactly the kind of dramatic backstory you'd expect from someone who wrote the preamble to the Constitution. The details are a bit murky. This was 1780, so medical records weren't exactly comprehensive, but the generally accepted story is that Morris was out for a carriage ride. The horses spooked, and the carriage wheel ran over his left leg so thoroughly that it had to be amputated. Some historians have suggested there might have been more to the story. Whispers about a jealous husband, a hasty escape through a window, a jump that went wrong. Morris himself never really clarified, which only added to his mystique. What we do know is that he lost a leg, refused to wear a prosthetic because he thought they were vain and uncomfortable, and instead walked with a wooden peg leg and a cane for the rest of his life. And here's the thing about Gouverneur Morris. He did not let this slow him down. Not even a little bit. If anything, it seemed to embolden him. Here was a man who, after losing a limb, decided the appropriate response was to become even more flamboyant, even more rakish, even more willing to throw himself into whatever adventure presented itself. After the Constitution was written and ratified, with his preamble intact, thank you very much, Morris was sent to France as a diplomat. This was 1792. The French Revolution was in full swing. The guillotine was working overtime. The streets of Paris were literally running red with aristocratic blood. And Gouverneur Morris, American aristocrat with a peg leg and no sense of self-preservation, decided this was the perfect time to start a torrid affair with a French countess. Her name was Adélaïde de Flo, and she was, by all accounts, exactly the kind of woman you'd expect a one-legged American diplomat to fall for during the Reign of Terror. Beautiful, intelligent, married to someone else, and deeply embedded in the exact social circles that were being systematically dismantled by the revolutionaries. Morris courted her openly, wrote her passionate letters, met her in secret, which again is a fascinating choice when the secret police are arresting people for looking suspicious. He also used his position as American minister to France to help protect aristocrats fleeing the terror. He hid people in his home. He used diplomatic immunity like a shield. He wrote letters to the new French government that were so diplomatically worded they made his actual opinions impossible to discern. And all the while, he was hopping around Paris on his peg leg, attending salons, writing letters home, describing the chaos with a detached amusement of someone watching a particularly dramatic play. His letters from this period are something else. He'd write about dinner parties where half the guests were scheduled for execution the next morning. He'd describe the sound of the guillotine with the same casual tone he'd use for the weather. Another head fell today, he might write. The weather remains unseasonably warm. It was dark comedy before dark comedy existed, narrated by a man who seemed constitutionally incapable of taking anything, including revolutionary violence, entirely seriously. Morris eventually left France in 1794, returned to America, and settled into a life of comfortable obscurity. He served one term as a U.S. Senator from New York, married at age 57, had a son, and generally lived the kind of quiet post revolutionary life that doesn't make it into history books. He died in 1816, not from anything dramatic or revolutionary, but from complications after attempting to clear a urinary blockage with a piece of whalebone, which is exactly the kind of stubbornly independent, slightly absurd end you'd expect from a man who refused prosthetics and courted countesses during the Terror. But here's what really gets me about Gouverneur Morris. He was broke when he died. This man, born into wealth, who helped write the Constitution, who served as a diplomat, who rubbed elbows with the most powerful people on 2 continents, he died in debt. His land speculations had failed. His investments had soured. The Morris fortune, which had seemed so unassailable when he was young, had evaporated. And yet those 3 words he wrote lived on. We the people. They outlasted his fortune, his reputation, his romantic scandals, his diplomatic career. They became the foundation of American identity, the shorthand for democratic ideals, the phrase that lawyers and activists and presidents would invoke for centuries. And most people who quote them have absolutely no idea who wrote them. That's the thing about Gouverneur Morris. He's been almost completely forgotten, overshadowed by Madison and Hamilton and all the founders who got better press, better monuments, better Broadway musicals. His flamboyant personal style, the affairs, the peg leg, the sarcastic letters clashed with the buttoned-up mythology we built around the founding fathers. We wanted them to be marble statues, not flesh and blood aristocrats, limping around Paris trying to save their girlfriends from the guillotine. But maybe that's exactly why his story matters, because it reminds us that the Constitution, that sacred document we treat like it descended from heaven on stone tablets, was written by actual humans. Flawed, complicated, sometimes absurd humans. A guy with one leg who rejected prosthetics as vanity wrote the most famous sentence in American governance. And then he went to France and had an affair during a revolution. If that's not the most American story you've ever heard, I don't know what is. And speaking of founders who've been buried by history despite doing the actual work that made America possible, let me tell you about the man who wrote the blueprint for the Bill of Rights and then refused to sign the Constitution because it didn't include those rights. The rebel who wrote the Bill of Rights and refused to sign the Constitution. George Mason was not a team player. This is important to understand right from the start. While everyone else at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 was trying to find compromises, build consensus, and create something that could actually get ratified, Mason was sitting in the back row taking notes on everything that was wrong with the whole enterprise. And when they finally finished, when everyone was ready to sign this document they'd spent months creating, Mason looked at what they'd produced and said, essentially, no thanks. Not because he was against a strong federal government. Not because he wanted to stick with the Articles of Confederation. But because the Constitution, as written, had no Bill of Rights. No explicit protections for individual liberties. No guarantees that this new government wouldn't become exactly the kind of tyranny they'd just fought a war to escape. And here's the thing. Mason knew what he was talking about. Because 11 years earlier, in 1776, he'd written the Virginia Declaration of Rights, the document that Thomas Jefferson cribbed from when writing the Declaration of Independence, the blueprint that would eventually become the U.S. Bill of Rights. Mason had literally invented the modern concept of enumerated individual rights in government documents. So when he said the Constitution needed a Bill of Rights, it wasn't some random complaint. It was the founding father equivalent of your architect telling you that the house you're building doesn't have a foundation. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start at the beginning. George Mason was born in 1725 to a wealthy Virginia planting family. His father drowned when Mason was 10, thrown from a boat in the Potomac during a storm, leaving young George to be raised by his uncle, who was also a wealthy planter. This was the Virginia aristocracy in its purest form. Thousands of acres, hundreds of enslaved people, a life of leisure built on the backs of human chattel. Mason inherited it all, expanded it, and became one of the wealthiest men in Virginia. He also, and this is where things get complicated, became one of the Revolution's most vocal advocates for individual liberty. The contradiction here is not subtle. Mason owned approximately 300 enslaved people, 300 human beings whose liberty he controlled absolutely. And yet he wrote some of the most soaring rhetoric about human rights and freedom that the 18th century produced. The Virginia Declaration of Rights, his masterpiece, begins that all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights. All men, equally free. Written by a man who owned 300 people. To be clear, Mason was aware of this hypocrisy. He argued against the slave trade at the Constitutional Convention, calling it diabolical, and predicting it would bring the judgment of heaven on the nation. He pushed for clauses that would allow Congress to ban the importation of enslaved people. He genuinely seemed to believe that slavery was morally wrong and economically disastrous, but he didn't free his enslaved people. He didn't stop owning human beings. He managed to hold both beliefs simultaneously, that slavery was evil and that he was going to keep doing it, in a way that feels impossible to modern sensibilities, but was apparently just fine in 18th century Virginia. Still, the Virginia Declaration of Rights was genuinely revolutionary. Written in May of 1776, weeks before the Declaration of Independence, it laid out principles that were radical for their time. That all men are created equal, that government derives its power from the consent of the governed, that people have the right to reform or abolish governments that become tyrannical. It guaranteed freedom of the press, trial by jury, protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. It was, in short, everything the American Revolution was supposedly fighting for, put down on paper in clear, forceful language. And it directly influenced the Declaration of Independence. When Jefferson wrote, "All men are created equal," he was echoing Mason's, "All men are by nature equally free and independent." The whole structure of the Declaration, the list of grievances, the philosophical justification, the assertion of rights, follows the pattern Mason established in the Virginia Declaration. Jefferson was the better writer, the more poetic stylist, but Mason built the framework. After the Revolution, Mason mostly stayed home. He didn't want national office. He refused appointment to the Continental Congress multiple times. He was content to manage his plantation, Gunston Hall, and engage in Virginia politics. He was, by all accounts, a private person who disliked travel and public speaking, which makes it all the more significant that he agreed to attend the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. He went because he believed in the project. He thought the Articles of Confederation were failing, that the country needed a stronger central government. He was ready to help build something new. And for the first few months of the convention, he did exactly that. He spoke frequently, argued forcefully, contributed ideas. He was one of the most active delegates. But as the summer wore on, Mason grew increasingly troubled. The Constitution they were creating was concentrating too much power in the federal government. It gave too much authority to the president. It didn't adequately protect individual liberties. And most importantly, it had no Bill of Rights. Mason raised this concern repeatedly. In early September, just days before the convention was set to adjourn, he proposed that they add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution. It wouldn't take long, he argued. They could use the Virginia Declaration of Rights as a model, adapt it to the federal level, and have it done in a matter of days. The proposal was voted down. Not narrowly, unanimously. Every state delegation voted against it. The reasons varied. Some delegates thought a Bill of Rights was unnecessary. State constitutions already had them, so why duplicate the effort? Some worried it would delay ratification. Some genuinely believed that enumerating rights was dangerous, that listing specific rights might imply that those were the only rights people had. But the result was the same: no Bill of Rights. Mason was furious, and when the final version of the Constitution was presented for signing on September 17th, 1787, George Mason refused to sign it. Along with Edmund Randolph and Elbridge Gerry, he declined to put his name on the document. But unlike the other two, who had various procedural objections, Mason was clear about his reasoning. No Bill of Rights meant no signature. This was not a small thing. Mason was risking his reputation, his legacy, his standing among the other founders. These were men he'd worked with for years, men who were now looking at him like he'd betrayed the cause. James Madison, his fellow Virginian and friend, was particularly hurt. But Mason didn't budge. He then did something even more radical. He went home and wrote a pamphlet called Objections to the Constitution of Government Formed by the Convention. In it, he laid out exactly why the Constitution was dangerous without a Bill of Rights. It was distributed throughout Virginia and became one of the most influential anti-federalist documents. Mason, the wealthy aristocrat who'd helped spark the Revolution, had become one of the Constitution's most prominent opponents. This is where it gets interesting, because Mason's objections sparked a national debate. The Federalists, the people who supported the Constitution as written, had to respond. They had to explain why a Bill of Rights wasn't necessary, and they had to convince enough people to ratify the Constitution anyway. They succeeded, but barely. Virginia's ratification convention in 1788 was a knife fight. Mason argued against ratification with everything he had. Patrick Henry joined him. Together, they nearly derailed the whole thing. Virginia ratified by a vote of 89 to 79, 10 votes. If 11 people had switched sides, there might not be a United States as we know it. But Mason's objections had an effect. Several states ratified the Constitution with the explicit understanding that a Bill of Rights would be added immediately. It became a condition of ratification. And in 1789, James Madison, who had initially opposed the Bill of Rights, introduced 12 amendments to the First Congress. 10 of them were ratified and became the Bill of Rights. Those 10 amendments borrowed heavily from George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights. The freedom of speech and press, the right to bear arms, protection against unreasonable searches, the right to trial by jury. All of it echoed language Mason had written 13 years earlier. The man who refused to sign the Constitution had essentially forced the creation of the Bill of Rights through sheer stubbornness. And yet, he gets almost no credit for it. There's no George Mason monument on the National Mall. No George Mason dollar bill. Most Americans, if they know the name at all, know it because of George Mason University in Virginia. And even then, they probably couldn't tell you who he was or what he did. Part of this is because Mason cultivated privacy. He didn't write memoirs. He didn't seek publicity. He didn't position himself as a historical figure the way Jefferson and Adams did. And part of it is because his anti-federalist stance made him unpopular among the people writing the early histories of the Republic. The winners write the history, and the Federalists won. Mason, who'd opposed them, got written out. There's also the awkward fact that Mason and George Washington, his neighbor, his friend, his quondam friend, as Mason bitterly called him, after their falling out, ended up on opposite sides of the ratification debate. Washington supported the Constitution wholeheartedly. Mason opposed it just as strongly. Their friendship never recovered. And when you're George Mason going up against George Washington in the historical memory competition, you're going to lose every time. Mason died in 1792, just 4 years after the Constitution was ratified. He caught a severe cold that developed into pneumonia, and in an era before antibiotics, that was pretty much that. He was 66 years old. He died at home at Gunston Hall, surrounded by family, knowing that the Bill of Rights, his real legacy, had been added to the Constitution he'd refused to sign. His last years had been quiet, almost lonely. He'd largely withdrawn from public life after the ratification fight. He corresponded with old friends, managed his plantation, watched the new government take shape from a distance. He lived long enough to see the Bill of Rights ratified in 1791. Long enough to know that his objections had been vindicated, but not long enough to see how thoroughly he'd be forgotten. And here's what kills me about George Mason. He was right. About everything. The Constitution did need a Bill of Rights. Individual liberties did need explicit protection. The federal government could become tyrannical without those safeguards. He saw it clearly in 1787, argued for it passionately, refused to compromise, and ultimately forced the issue through sheer obstinacy. He was the founding father who stood up and said no, when everyone else was saying yes, and he was proven right. But we don't remember him. We remember the people who signed the Constitution without the Bill of Rights. We remember the people who initially opposed adding those rights. We remember George Washington, who froze Mason out after their disagreement. We even remember James Madison for writing the Bill of Rights, even though he only did it because people like Mason forced his hand. George Mason wrote the blueprint for American liberty twice, once in 1776 with the Virginia Declaration of Rights, and again in 1787 by refusing to accept anything less for the Constitution. And for his trouble, he got erased from the story. But those rights remain. The First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, all 10 of them. They're Mason's real monument. Every time someone invokes freedom of speech, every time a court strikes down an unreasonable search, every time the Bill of Rights protects an individual against government overreach, that's George Mason's legacy, even if nobody remembers his name. And speaking of people who risked everything for independence, let me tell you about the man who rode through a thunderstorm to cast the tie-breaking vote that created America, the midnight rider who actually mattered. You know who Paul Revere was, right? Of course you do. Everyone knows Paul Revere. He rode through the night, warning that the British were coming, became an American legend, got immortalized in a Longfellow poem that every school kid has to memorize. Except here's the thing. Paul Revere's ride, while certainly brave and useful, didn't actually change the course of history. He warned some people, got captured by the British, and went home. That's it. The midnight ride that actually mattered, the one that literally created America, happened on July 2nd, 1776, and was made by a guy you've probably never heard of. His name was Caesar Rodney, and he rode 80 miles through a thunderstorm while dying of cancer to cast the vote that made American independence happen. Let me set the scene for you. It's July 1st, 1776. The Second Continental Congress is meeting in Philadelphia, and they're about to vote on whether to declare independence from Britain. This is it. This is the moment. After months of debate, after years of escalating conflict, they're finally going to put it to a vote. And the Delaware delegation has a problem. Delaware had 3 delegates: George Reed, Thomas McKean, and Caesar Rodney. Red was opposed to independence. McKean was in favor. Rodney was back home in Delaware, 80 miles away, dealing with a loyalist uprising and trying to keep the colony from falling apart. Without Rodney's vote, Delaware was deadlocked. And a deadlocked Delaware meant no unanimous vote for independence, which meant the whole thing could fall apart before it even started. So Thomas McKean did what any desperate delegate would do. He sent an urgent message to Caesar Rodney. Get here. Now, we need your vote. The message reached Rodney on the night of July 1st. He was in Dover, Delaware. Philadelphia was 80 miles away. There were no highways, no cars, no trains, just dirt roads that turned to mud when it rained. And it was raining. Not a light drizzle, not a pleasant summer shower, but a full-on thunderstorm, the kind that turns roads into rivers and makes you question every life choice that led you to be outside in this mess. Caesar Rodney looked at that storm, looked at the message, looked at his horse, and made a decision. He mounted up and rode. For 16 hours straight, through lightning and thunder and rain that would have sent any reasonable person looking for shelter, Caesar Rodney rode north. He rode through the night, through the storm, through exhaustion and pain, and there was a lot of pain, which we'll get to in a minute. He rode past Dover, past Smyrna, past Wilmington, pushing his horse and himself to the absolute limit. And on July the 2nd, 1776, mud-splattered and exhausted, still wearing his riding boots and spurs, Caesar Rodney walked into Independence Hall just in time to cast Delaware's vote for independence. The vote was taken. Delaware voted yes. The Declaration of Independence was approved. America was born. And Caesar Rodney, having literally ridden through hell to make it happen, probably went looking for somewhere to sit down. Now here's the part that makes this story even more remarkable. Caesar Rodney made that ride while his face was being eaten away by cancer. We don't know exactly what kind of cancer it was. Medical diagnosis in the 18th century was about as precise as throwing darts at a medical textbook while blindfolded. But we know it was facial cancer, probably skin cancer, possibly melanoma. We know it started sometime in the 1760s and progressively worsened over the years. And we know that by 1776, it had gotten bad enough that Rodney habitually wore a green silk scarf wrapped around the lower part of his face to hide the damage. A green scarf. Let that sink in for a moment. The man who rode through a thunderstorm to create America did it while wearing what was essentially the 18th century equivalent of a medical mask, hiding a face that was slowly being destroyed by disease. Portraits of Rodney from this period show him in profile, the left side of his face turned away from the viewer. This wasn't artistic choice. This was necessity. Contemporary accounts describe him as having lost part of his nose and cheek to the cancer. He was in constant pain. He knew he was dying. And he rode 80 miles through a storm anyway. After the vote, Rodney signed the Declaration of Independence on August 2nd, 1776. His signature is there on that famous document, right alongside John Hancock's flamboyant scrawl and Benjamin Franklin's steady hand. Caesar Rodney, his face hidden behind green silk, putting his name to treason and revolution. But here's where the story takes a turn that somehow manages to be both patriotic and depressing. The Continental Congress, grateful for Rodney's service and aware of his deteriorating health, offered him a military command. Rodney had military experience. He'd led Delaware militia units, organized defenses, proven himself capable. And in 1776, military commands came with prestige, glory, a chance to make your name in battle. George Washington intervened. Not because he didn't respect Rodney, but because he did. Washington took one look at this dying man in a green scarf and decided that Delaware needed him more in political leadership than in military service. Rodney's organizational skills, his ability to rally support, his sheer determination, those were too valuable to risk on a battlefield. So Rodney stayed in Delaware, coordinating the war effort, raising troops, keeping the state together while his body fell apart. He served as Delaware's president, which was what they called the governor back then, from 1778 to 1781. He organized militia units. He dealt with British raids along the coast. He kept Delaware functioning as a state when it would have been easier to just collapse into chaos. And he did all of it while slowly dying, while the cancer ate away at his face, while he wrapped that green scarf a little tighter every month. The cancer won in 1784. Caesar Rodney died at his home in Kent County, Delaware, at the age of 55. He was buried in what was probably the family plot, though nobody bothered to mark the grave. No monument, no headstone, nothing. For over 200 years, the exact location of Caesar Rodney's grave was unknown. Let me repeat that. The man who rode 80 miles through a thunderstorm to cast the tie-breaking vote for American independence was buried in an unmarked grave and forgotten. There are a few theories about why this happened. The cynical explanation is that Delaware was broke after the Revolution, and elaborate funerals cost money. The charitable explanation is that Rodney himself was modest and wouldn't have wanted a fuss. The historical explanation is that he died during a period when the new nation was struggling to survive, and nobody had time to build monuments when they were busy trying to avoid starving or getting invaded by the British again. But the real explanation, the one that hurts, is simpler. Caesar Rodney didn't have a poet. Paul Revere got Longfellow. Revere's Midnight Ride got immortalized in verse that turned a relatively minor event into American mythology. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. Every schoolchild knows those lines. Every American grows up hearing about Revere's ride. Caesar Rodney got nothing. No poem, no myth, no tale passed down through generations. His ride, the one that actually mattered, the one that made independence possible, got buried along with his unmarked grave. Delaware eventually put Rodney on their state quarter in 1999, which is a nice gesture, but also kind of insulting when you think about it. Here's the guy who saved American independence. We'll put him on the 25-cent piece. But even that's more recognition than he got for most of American history. For over 200 years, Caesar Rodney was a footnote, a name in the history books that nobody bothered to read. And here's what really gets me about Caesar Rodney's story. He knew he was dying when he made that ride. He knew the cancer was going to kill him. He could have stayed home in Delaware, managed his pain, spent his remaining years in relative comfort. Nobody would have blamed him. He had every excuse in the world to say no. But he didn't. He got on his horse and rode through a thunderstorm because his vote mattered. Because independence mattered. Because sometimes the dying man is the only one who can do what needs to be done. There's something almost unbearably poignant about that image. Caesar Rodney, face hidden behind a green scarf, riding through the rain toward Philadelphia. Every mile must have been agony. The jarring of the horse, the wind and rain, the exhaustion, the pain from the cancer that was eating his face, all of it would have been screaming at him to stop, to turn back, to give up. But he didn't. He kept riding. And when he arrived at Independence Hall, mud-splattered and exhausted, and cast his vote for independence, he changed history. That vote, that moment, that decision made by a dying man in a green scarf, that's what made America possible. Not a poem, not a myth, not a legendary midnight ride that warned some farmers about British soldiers, but an actual, honest-to-God moment where one person's choice tipped the balance and created a nation. But we don't remember it. We remember Paul Revere instead. Caesar Rodney's story is a reminder that history isn't fair. It doesn't reward the people who deserve it most. It doesn't preserve the stories that matter most. It's arbitrary and cruel and often prefers a good legend to a better truth. Rodney rode farther, risked more, accomplished more than Revere ever did. And for his trouble, he got an unmarked grave and 2 centuries of obscurity. But the vote remains. On July the 2nd, 1776, Delaware voted for independence because Caesar Rodney rode through a storm to make it happen. And whether we remember him or not, that vote created the country we live in today. Every 4th of July firework, every Independence Day celebration, every time we talk about American freedom, all of it traces back to that moment when a dying man in a green scarf said, yes, even if we forgot to write it down properly. And speaking of people who showed up when it mattered most, let me tell you about the only founding father who managed to sign everything, the cobbler who signed everything. So here's a fun bit of historical trivia that somehow never makes it into the textbooks. There was exactly one person who signed all four of America's founding documents: the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. Well, technically, he didn't sign the Bill of Rights since those were amendments, but he was instrumental in getting them through Congress, so we'll give him credit. One person managed to be present and accounted for at every single critical moment in early American history. His name was Roger Sherman, and he started out as a cobbler. Not a wealthy planter like George Mason, not an aristocrat like Gouverneur Morris, not even a middle-class merchant. Roger Sherman made shoes. He was a craftsman, a tradesman, the kind of person who worked with his hands and smelled like leather and probably had calluses that could sand wood. And somehow this self-taught cobbler from Connecticut became one of the most important political figures in early American history. Sherman was born in 1721 in Newton, Massachusetts, to a farming family that had exactly 0 political connections and approximately the same amount of money. His father was a farmer and shoemaker who died when Roger was 19, leaving young Sherman to support the family. So Sherman did what you did in 1740. He learned a trade. Specifically, he learned to make shoes. But here's the thing about Roger Sherman. He was constitutionally incapable of being satisfied with just one skill. While he was making shoes during the day, he was teaching himself mathematics at night, then surveying, then law, then astronomy for some reason, because why not add astronomical calculations to your resume when you're already a cobbler, surveyor, mathematician, lawyer? The man collected skills like some people collect stamps. By his mid-20s, Sherman had moved to New Milford, Connecticut, set up a cobbler's shop, and started moonlighting as a surveyor. Then he started publishing almanacs, because of course he did, which required astronomical calculations for predicting weather and tides. These almanacs sold well enough that Sherman made a name for himself as someone who knew things. Useful things. Practical things. The kind of things that made you valuable in a colonial society that desperately needed people who could measure land and predict when to plant crops. Then he taught himself law. Just picked up some books and started reading. No law school, no formal training, just Roger Sherman in a library, teaching himself how to be a lawyer. And it worked. By 1750, he'd passed the bar and was practicing law in Connecticut. A decade later, he was one of the most respected attorneys in the colony. This is the part of Sherman's story that feels almost offensively American. The self-made man, the bootstrap puller, the guy who went from making shoes to making laws through nothing but hard work and determination. It's the kind of origin story that would make Benjamin Franklin nod approvingly. Except Sherman did it without Franklin's charm, without his wit, without any of the charisma that usually comes with that kind of success. Roger Sherman was, by all contemporary accounts, not a fun person to be around. He was stiff, formal, humorless. He spoke in clipped, precise sentences. He didn't make small talk. He didn't tell jokes. John Adams, who was not exactly known for being a party animal himself, described Sherman as honest as an angel and as firm in the cause of American independence as Mount Atlas. Which sounds like a compliment until you realize Adams is essentially saying, this guy's rigid and unmovable and about as much fun as a mountain. But what Sherman lacked in personality, he made up for in sheer reliability. When the Continental Congress needed someone to serve on a committee, Sherman volunteered. When they needed someone to draft a document, Sherman picked up a pen. When they needed someone to negotiate a compromise, Sherman showed up with proposals. He was the congressional equivalent of that one friend who always shows up to help you move, never complains, and somehow manages to carry the heaviest boxes without breaking a sweat. And he was everywhere. Seriously, everywhere. The Continental Congress. Sherman was there from 1774 to 1781, almost continuously. The Constitutional Convention. Sherman not only attended, but played a crucial role in brokering the Great Compromise, which created the bicameral legislature we still use today. The first Congress under the new Constitution, Sherman was elected to the House of Representatives, then the Senate. The man was like a constitutional Where's Waldo, except instead of hiding in the background, he was actively shaping the government. Let's talk about the Great Compromise, because this is where Sherman really earned his place in history. It's 1787, the Constitutional Convention is falling apart, and everyone's arguing about representation. The big states want representation based on population. More people, more votes. Makes sense. The small states want equal representation. One state, one vote, regardless of size. Also makes sense. Neither side will budge. The convention is about to collapse, and with it, any hope of replacing the failing Articles of Confederation. Enter Roger Sherman, cobbler turned statesman, with a proposal so simple it's almost insulting. Why not both? The Great Compromise, also called the Connecticut Compromise, was Sherman's brainchild. Create two houses of Congress. One, the House of Representatives, based on population. The other, the Senate, with equal representation for each state. Give both sides what they want by giving them both half of what they want. It's the kind of solution that seems obvious in hindsight, but required someone with Sherman's particular brand of practical thinking to actually propose. The compromise saved the convention. It saved the Constitution. It created the legislative structure we still use today, 230-something years later. And Roger Sherman, who probably delivered the proposal in the same flat, unexciting tone he used for everything else, went home that night having essentially designed Congress. But wait, there's more, because Roger Sherman wasn't done yet. When the Constitution was finished and sent to the states for ratification, Sherman wrote a series of essays defending it. When the first Congress convened, Sherman was there, serving in the House of Representatives. And when James Madison introduced the amendments that would become the Bill of Rights, Sherman had opinions. Strong opinions, as it turns out. Sherman opposed the Bill of Rights. Not because he was against protecting individual liberties, but because he thought it was redundant and dangerous. The Constitution already limited government power, he argued. Listing specific rights might imply those were the only rights people had. It was the same argument that had been made at the Constitutional Convention, and Sherman believed it sincerely. He lost that argument, obviously. The Bill of Rights was ratified in 1791. But Sherman's opposition shows something important about his character. He wasn't a yes man. He'd broker compromises when necessary, but he also had principles and wasn't afraid to stand by them, even when they made him unpopular. Now about those 15 children. Because yes, Roger Sherman fathered 15 children. 15. With 2 wives, to be clear. His first wife, Elizabeth Hartwell, had 7 children before dying in 1760. His second wife, Rebecca Prescott, had 8 more. 15 children total, all of whom Sherman apparently supported, while simultaneously serving in Congress, practicing law, and helping found a nation. The logistics of this are baffling. Congress in the 1770s and 80s wasn't a part-time gig. Sessions could last months. Travel took weeks. And Sherman was also practicing law, managing property, serving in various state positions, and somehow finding time to, father 15 children. The man's organizational skills must have been superhuman, or possibly he just never slept. What's remarkable is that Sherman managed to be an active, present father to these children while doing everything else. Contemporary accounts suggest he was involved in their education, their careers, their lives. He didn't just father 15 kids and disappear into politics, he actually raised them while helping create America as a side project. Roger Sherman died in 1793 while serving as a U.S. Senator from Connecticut. He was 72 years old, had been in public service for nearly 40 years, and had literally helped build every foundational document and institution of the American Republic. His funeral was attended by members of Congress, judges, various dignitaries, and presumably a substantial number of his children and grandchildren. But here's the thing about Roger Sherman's legacy. It's weirdly invisible. He signed the Declaration of Independence, but nobody quotes his speeches about it. He brokered the Great Compromise, but the Constitutional Convention is remembered as Madison's achievement. He served in the first Congress, but Hamilton and Jefferson get all the credit for shaping early government. Sherman was present at every critical moment, did essential work at every stage, and somehow managed to be forgotten anyway. Part of this is because Sherman didn't have a talent for self-promotion. He didn't write memoirs. He didn't cultivate a public image. He just did the work and went home, which is admirable. But it's also not how you get remembered by history. History loves a good story, a dramatic personality, a memorable quote. Sherman had none of these things. He had competence, reliability, and an almost pathological dedication to showing up and doing his job. He also had no scandals. None. Zero. Zip. In an era when founding fathers were constantly embroiled in affairs, financial speculation, political feuds, and various other drama, Roger Sherman was boring. He went to work, came home to his enormous family, and apparently lived a life of such relentless normalcy that there's nothing salacious to report, which is great for him, but terrible for historical narrative. Nobody writes books about the guy who showed up on time and did his job correctly for 40 years. But maybe that's exactly why Sherman's story matters. Because the American founding wasn't just dramatic speeches and daring rides and revolutionary fervor. It was also committee meetings, drafting sessions, endless debates about procedure and representation, compromise and negotiation, and bureaucratic grunt work. Someone had to do that work, and Roger Sherman did it consistently and competently for decades. He took himself from cobbler to congressman through sheer determination and self-education. He helped broker the compromise that made the Constitution possible. He served at every stage of American government formation. He raised 15 children while doing it all. And he did it without fanfare, without seeking glory, without apparently needing any recognition beyond the satisfaction of a job done correctly. Roger Sherman is the founding father nobody remembers. And maybe that's fitting, because the real work of building a nation, the tedious, unglamorous work of showing up day after day and making the system function, rarely gets remembered. But it's essential. And Sherman did it better than almost anyone. So here's to Roger Sherman, cobbler and statesman, father of 15 and signer of 4. The man who was everywhere when it mattered and nowhere in the history books afterward. The compromise broker, the reliable vote, the guy who made shoes before he made laws. America probably wouldn't exist without him. But we forgot to write that part down. And speaking of people who financed revolution only to end up bankrupt, let me introduce you to the man who literally bought American independence with his own fortune. The banker who bought a revolution and died in debtor's prison. Here's a question that should keep you awake at night, except we're trying to put you to sleep, so maybe just ponder it quietly. How do you pay for a revolution? Seriously. Wars are expensive. Soldiers need guns, ammunition, food, clothing, shoes that aren't falling apart. Navies need ships. Governments need buildings, paper, ink, people to do the boring administrative work that makes any organization function. All of this costs money, enormous amounts of money. And in 1776, the Continental Congress had approximately none. They had no power to tax. The states were broke. Britain had cut off trade. France hadn't started helping yet. The continental dollar was inflating faster than a balloon at a birthday party and about as valuable. So how did America pay for the revolution? Simple. One guy just paid for it himself. His name was Robert Morris, and he was probably the wealthiest merchant in America when the revolution started. Ships, trade, investments, property. Morris had built an empire in Philadelphia, the kind of fortune that made him one of the most powerful men in the colonies. And when the war started, he looked at the Continental Congress struggling to fund an army, looked at his own massive wealth, and essentially said, "Put it on my tab." Over the course of the Revolution, Robert Morris personally financed the American war effort to the tune of millions of pounds. He bought supplies with his own money. He guaranteed loans with his personal credit. He used his ships to run British blockades, bringing in desperately needed goods. When the Continental Army was starving at Valley Forge, Morris sent food. When Washington needed money to pay his troops, Morris found it. When the entire financial structure of the revolution was on the verge of collapse, Morris held it together through sheer force of will and his personal fortune. And here's the kicker. He died in debtor's prison, having never been fully repaid. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start at the beginning, because Robert Morris's story is complicated in ways that make modern financial scandals look simple. Morris was born in Liverpool, England in 1734, which immediately makes him not technically American by birth, though he immigrated to Maryland as a teenager and spent the rest of his life in the colonies. His father was a tobacco merchant who died when Robert was young, leaving the boy to make his own way. Morris apprenticed with a shipping firm in Philadelphia, proved himself brilliant at commerce, and by his mid-20s was a full partner in what became one of the largest mercantile houses in America. Willing Morris and Company. That was the firm's name. They imported, exported, traded, speculated, and generally made money in every way that was legal in the 18th century, and several ways that were ethically questionable. Morris became extraordinarily wealthy. He married well, had 7 children, built a mansion, lived the life of a Philadelphia aristocrat. He was exactly the kind of person who should have stayed loyal to Britain when the revolution started, because the revolution threatened everything he'd built. Instead, he joined it. Signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Risked everything, his fortune, his life, his family's security, on a rebellion that had maybe a 50-50 chance of success and a 100% chance of getting him hanged if it failed. Why? The cynical answer is that Morris saw a business opportunity. The revolution meant contracts, trade, chances to make money. And Morris did make money during the war. His firms supplied the army, ran goods through British blockades, turned a profit even while financing the rebellion. This made him controversial then and controversial now. Was he a patriot or a profiteer? The answer, frustratingly, is both. Morris believed in American independence. He also believed in making money. These two beliefs weren't contradictory in his mind. He could finance the revolution and profit from it simultaneously, and he saw nothing wrong with this arrangement, which bothered people then and bothers historians now, but it's also probably the only reason the revolution succeeded. Because here's the thing about Robert Morris. When the Continental Congress needed money and had no way to get it, Morris found ways. He organized lotteries. He set up a network of merchants who would extend credit based on his personal guarantee. He convinced French bankers to make loans. He used his ships to bring in military supplies. He literally kept the American financial system functioning through personal relationships and creative financing. In 1781, when the war was entering its final phase and the Continental Congress was completely broke, and I mean completely, couldn't pay the troops, about to collapse broke, Morris was appointed Superintendent of Finance. Essentially, he became America's first Secretary of the Treasury, though the position wouldn't officially exist until the Constitution was ratified. And he performed miracles. He established the Bank of North America, the first chartered bank in the United States. He reorganized the continental currency. He negotiated loans from France and the Netherlands. He somehow convinced creditors to extend payment deadlines. And when Washington needed funds for the Yorktown campaign, the campaign that would end the war, Morris personally guaranteed the money, used his own credit, his own reputation, to secure the funds that won American independence. Yorktown succeeded. Cornwallis surrendered. The war effectively ended. And Robert Morris had personally financed the victory. After the Revolution, Morris continued his financial wizardry. He attended the Constitutional Convention in 1787, signed the Constitution, and helped push for its ratification. He served briefly in the U.S. Senate. He mentored Alexander Hamilton, teaching the younger man about finance and banking. When Hamilton became the actual Secretary of the Treasury, much of his financial system was based on ideas he'd learned from Morris, but then it all went wrong. Spectacularly, catastrophically wrong. Morris had spent the war years making money and spending it on the Revolution simultaneously. After the war, he tried to recoup his losses through land speculation. This was common among the founding fathers. Washington did it. Jefferson did it. Basically, everyone with money speculated in Western lands. But Morris went big, really big. He bought millions of acres of land in Pennsylvania, New York, Virginia, Kentucky, Georgia. He developed planned communities. He built infrastructure. He invested everything he had and everything he could borrow into these schemes. And the market collapsed. Land prices plummeted. Morris's investments became worthless. He couldn't sell the land. He couldn't pay his debts. Creditors came calling. Morris, who had financed a revolution, who had held the American economy together through sheer force of will, was suddenly bankrupt. In 1798, Robert Morris was arrested for debt and sent to the Prune Street debtors' prison in Philadelphia. The man who had signed the Declaration of Independence, who had literally bought American independence with his own money, was locked up because he couldn't pay his bills. He spent 3.5 years in debtors' prison. 3.5 years in a small cell, stripped of his wealth, his status, his dignity. The government he'd helped create, the nation he'd personally financed, did nothing to help him. Congress had never fully reimbursed him for his Revolutionary War expenditures. The loans he'd guaranteed, the money he'd advanced, the credit he'd extended, most of it was never repaid. Morris had spent his fortune creating America, and America let him rot in prison. He was finally released in 1801, after Congress passed a bankruptcy law, a law that existed partly because Morris's case had demonstrated the need for it. By that point, Morris was 67 years old, physically and financially broken. He lived his final years in a small house in Philadelphia, supported by friends and family, a shadow of the titan he'd once been. Robert Morris died in 1806 at the age of 72. He was buried in the family vault at Christ Church in Philadelphia, the same church where many of the founding fathers had worshipped. A modest funeral for a man who'd once been one of the wealthiest and most powerful people in America. And here's what really stings about Morris's story. He was never fully reimbursed for what he'd spent on the Revolution. The government acknowledged that money was owed to him. Multiple Congresses reviewed his accounts, but the sums were enormous. The records were complicated, and ultimately the government just didn't pay him. They let the matter drag on until Morris died, and then it quietly disappeared from the books. The irony is almost too perfect. Morris had created the financial systems that allowed the United States to function. He'd established the bank, organized the currency, negotiated the loans. He'd essentially invented American public finance. And then he died broke because that same system refused to pay its debts to him. There's also the uncomfortable fact that Morris made his early fortune partly through slave trading. Before the Revolution, his firm had imported enslaved people as part of their general cargo business. This was common among merchants at the time, but that doesn't make it less horrifying. Morris later became uncomfortable with slavery, freed the enslaved people he personally owned, and supported gradual abolition. But he'd still participated in the trade, still profited from human misery. It's a stain on his legacy that can't be erased or excused. Morris's story is complicated. He was a patriot and a profiteer. He financed American independence and made money doing it. He created the systems that allowed the United States to function economically, and then died bankrupt because those systems failed him. He participated in the slave trade and later regretted it. He was brilliant, ambitious, generous, and reckless. He saved the revolution and destroyed himself in the process, and we barely remember him. The title financier of the revolution that should rightfully be his has been lost to obscurity. Most Americans, if they know the name Robert Morris at all, probably think of the university named after him. They don't know he signed the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. They don't know he personally funded the revolution. They don't know he died in debtor's prison, but the systems he created remain. The Bank of North America evolved into the American banking system. His financial innovations became the foundation for Hamilton's Treasury Department. The loans he negotiated, the credit he extended, the networks he built, all of it became part of the infrastructure of American capitalism. Every time you use a bank, every time you take out a loan, every time the government borrows money, you're using systems that trace back to Robert Morris's innovations. He bought American independence and died bankrupt. He created American finance and was destroyed by debt. He risked everything for the revolution and lost it all anyway. And for his trouble, he got 3.5 years in debtor's prison and a footnote in history books. But the nation he helped create survives. The financial systems he invented still function. The revolution he financed still matters, even if we've forgotten who paid for it. And speaking of revolutionary heroes whose medical practices might have killed more people than they saved, let me tell you about the doctor who signed the Declaration and then bled his patients to death during an epidemic. The doctor who cured America by bleeding it. There's something deeply American about Benjamin Rush. Not in the patriotic, flag-waving sense, though he was certainly patriotic, but in the sense that he embodied all of our best impulses and worst instincts simultaneously, usually at the same time, with complete confidence that he was doing the right thing. He was brilliant and stubborn, compassionate and wrong, a reformer who sometimes made things worse through sheer determination to make them better. He signed the Declaration of Independence. He pioneered mental health treatment in America. He pushed for abolition, public education, and women's rights. He also bled patients to death during the yellow fever epidemic of 1793, convinced he was saving them while they literally expired from blood loss. Benjamin Rush was, in short, the kind of complicated historical figure who makes you want to both applaud and cringe, sometimes in the same sentence. Let's start with the good stuff because there's a lot of it. Rush was born in 1746 in Byberry, Pennsylvania, to a farming family. His father died when Rush was 6, leaving his mother to raise him and his siblings alone. She managed it somehow and even sent young Benjamin to school. He proved himself brilliant, graduated from the College of New Jersey, now Princeton, at age 14, and then apprenticed with a physician in Philadelphia. 14 years old and already committed to medicine. That's either impressive precocity or a sign that childhood in colonial America was just different. Probably both. Rush studied medicine in Edinburgh, Scotland, which at the time was the premier medical education you could get. He learned from the best doctors in the world, absorbed the latest medical theories, and returned to Philadelphia in 1769, ready to revolutionize American medicine. He was 23 years old and absolutely convinced he knew how everything worked. He immediately started teaching at the College of Philadelphia, the first chemistry professor in America. He established a medical practice. He wrote papers, gave lectures, and generally made himself one of the most prominent physicians in the colonies. And then, because being a doctor and professor apparently wasn't enough, he got involved in politics. By 1776, Rush was attending meetings of the Continental Congress, advocating for independence, and generally making himself useful to the revolutionary cause. When the Declaration of Independence was ready for signing, Rush stepped up. At 30 years old, he was one of the youngest signers, putting his name to treason with the same confidence he brought to medical practice. And then, because he apparently had unlimited energy, Rush volunteered for military service. He was appointed Surgeon General of the Middle Department of the Continental Army, responsible for medical care for thousands of soldiers. This is where things started to get complicated. Rush quickly became horrified by the conditions in military hospitals. Soldiers were dying not from wounds, but from infections, dysentery, typhus, and general neglect. Supplies were inadequate, sanitation was non-existent, and the medical care was, in Rush's opinion, criminally incompetent. So he did what any principled person would do. He started writing angry letters to Congress and George Washington, demanding reforms. This did not make him popular. Washington, dealing with a war and a perpetually underfunded army, did not appreciate being lectured by a doctor about hospital conditions. Rush's complaints became increasingly strident. He started publicly criticizing Washington's leadership, questioning his competence, suggesting he should be replaced. By 1778, Rush had essentially talked himself out of his military position. He resigned and returned to Philadelphia, convinced he'd been proven right about everything. But here's the thing. Rush wasn't wrong about the hospital conditions. Soldiers were dying unnecessarily. The medical care was inadequate. Rush's criticisms, however abrasive, were largely accurate. He just delivered them with all the tact of a sledgehammer. Back in civilian practice, Rush became one of America's most influential physicians. He taught thousands of medical students. He published extensively. He developed theories about disease and treatment that would dominate American medicine for decades. And some of those theories were, well, let's just say they were very confident and very wrong. Rush believed in heroic medicine. The basic idea was that diseases were caused by imbalances in the body, and the cure was to aggressively restore balance through bleeding, purging, and inducing vomiting. If a little bloodletting didn't work, try more bloodletting. If the patient was still sick, bleed them again. And again. And again, until they either recovered or died. At which point you could at least say you'd tried everything. This brings us to the yellow fever epidemic of 1793, which killed roughly 5,000 people in Philadelphia, about 10% of the city's population. It was a catastrophe. People were dying in the streets. Families were fleeing the city. The government relocated, and Benjamin Rush, convinced he understood the disease, stayed to treat patients. His treatment protocol was simple. Bleed the patient extensively, give them massive doses of calomel, which is basically mercury and will absolutely poison you, and purge their system until they were too weak to resist. This treatment, Rush believed, would restore balance to the body and cure the fever. It didn't. It killed people. Lots of people. Patients who might have survived with rest and fluids were bled until they had nothing left. Rush himself almost died during the epidemic, contracting yellow fever and treating himself with his own methods. That he survived is either a testament to his constitution or pure luck, because his treatment should have killed him. But here's what makes Rush's story even more complicated. He genuinely believed he was helping. He saw patients recover after his treatments and attributed their survival to bloodletting, ignoring the ones who died. When other doctors criticized his methods, Rush doubled down, convinced they were the ones who didn't understand. He published papers defending his approach, taught it to students, and promoted it for decades. And people believed him. Benjamin Rush was so respected, so prominent, that his medical theories dominated American practice well into the 19th century. Generations of doctors bled their patients because Rush said it worked. The man essentially set American medicine back by decades through sheer force of personality. But, and this is important, Rush also did genuinely good work. He was one of the first American physicians to seriously study mental illness, and his approaches, while outdated by modern standards, were revolutionary for his time. He advocated treating the mentally ill with kindness rather than chains. He pushed for institutions that would care for people rather than simply imprisoning them. His book, Medical Inquiries and Observations upon the Diseases of the Mind, is considered one of the founding texts of American psychiatry. He was also a passionate abolitionist. Rush wrote pamphlets against slavery, helped found the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, and argued that slavery was morally indefensible. This was not a popular position among the founding fathers, many of whom owned enslaved people, but Rush held it firmly. He believed in human equality, even if his medical practices suggested otherwise. He advocated for public education, arguing that democracy required an educated populace. He pushed for better treatment of prisoners, for women's education, for temperance. He had opinions about everything and shared them freely, convinced that his superior understanding gave him both the right and the duty to reform society. Benjamin Rush died in 1813, at age 67, still practicing medicine and still convinced his methods were correct. He was eulogized as the father of American medicine, a title that feels both deserved and deeply ironic. He pioneered mental health treatment while bleeding fever patients to death. He fought for human rights while administering toxic mercury. He was brilliant and wrong, compassionate and dangerous, a reformer who sometimes caused the harms he was trying to prevent. And we've largely forgotten him. Most Americans don't know he signed the Declaration of Independence. They don't know he founded American psychiatry. They don't know he almost destroyed American medicine with bloodletting. Rush exists in this weird historical limbo where he's simultaneously too important to ignore and too problematic to celebrate. The truth is that Benjamin Rush was human in the most complicated sense. He was capable of great insight and terrible judgment, often simultaneously. He saved lives and ended them. He fought injustice and perpetuated harm. He was the Enlightenment in microcosm, brilliant, confident, progressive, and sometimes catastrophically wrong about basic facts. But the systems he helped create, mental health institutions, public health initiatives, medical education programs, those survive. His mistakes were eventually corrected. His insights were built upon. And the Declaration of Independence still bears his signature, right there alongside Franklin's and Jefferson's, a permanent reminder that he was present when America was born, even if his medical practice might have prevented a few people from living to see it. And speaking of revolutionary heroes who achieved the impossible against overwhelming odds, let me tell you about the general who never lost a supply line. Washington's shadow. General. So here's a military fact that should be better known. The American Revolution was almost lost in the South. While everyone focuses on Valley Forge and Yorktown, the Southern campaign from 1778 to 1781 was where the war nearly collapsed. The British had taken Savannah, then Charleston, and were systematically rolling through Georgia and the Carolinas, crushing American forces and recruiting loyalists. By 1780, the Continental Army in the South was in shambles, having lost nearly 5,000 troops at Charleston alone. The situation was so desperate that George Washington did something he rarely did. He asked for help. The man he turned to was Nathaniel Greene, and this is where things get interesting. Because Greene wasn't a professional soldier, he was a Quaker from Rhode Island who'd been raised in a pacifist religious tradition that explicitly forbade violence. Before the Revolution, Greene ran his family's iron forge, read military history as a hobby, and walked with a pronounced limp from a childhood injury. He had no military training, no combat experience, and a religious background that should have kept him far away from any battlefield. And yet, Washington trusted him more than almost anyone else in the Continental Army. Greene had joined the Rhode Island militia in 1774, despite being expelled from his Quaker meeting for even attending a military function. When the Revolution started, he was promoted from private to brigadier general essentially overnight, which tells you something about the desperate lack of qualified officers in the Continental Army. He fought at Bunker Hill, led troops through the New York campaigns, survived Valley Forge, and gradually proved himself to be one of Washington's most capable commanders. So in October of 1780, when Washington needed someone to salvage the Southern campaign, he sent Greene. Not with a massive army or unlimited supplies, but with the authority to do whatever was necessary to stop the British advance. And Greene, despite having every reason to fail, somehow turned the entire war around. Here's how he did it. He lost almost every battle he fought and won the war anyway. This sounds like a contradiction, but it's actually brilliant military strategy. Greene understood something fundamental about the Southern campaign that the British didn't. He didn't need to win battles. He needed to survive them. The British had supply lines stretching back to Charleston and the coast. Greene's forces could live off the land, melt into the countryside, and reform after defeats. So Greene fought battles designed not to win but to exhaust the British, forcing them to march, fight, march again, always staying just out of reach. At Guilford Courthouse in March 1781, Greene's forces fought Lord Cornwallis to a tactical draw that felt like a British victory but cost Cornwallis a quarter of his army in casualties. Cornwallis technically held the field at the end, but his losses were so severe he had to retreat to the coast. Greene had lost the battle but won the strategic objective. One British officer supposedly said afterward, "Another such victory would ruin the British army." Greene kept this up throughout the Southern campaign. He'd engage British forces, inflict casualties, retreat before being destroyed, and then regroup while the British exhausted themselves chasing him. He coordinated with partisan fighters like Francis Marion and Thomas Sumter, who harassed British supply lines and kept Loyalist forces off balance. He never lost his supply lines, which in the context of 18th century warfare was almost miraculous. Armies ran on logistics, and Greene kept his forces fed, supplied, and mobile even while operating in hostile territory with minimal resources. By the fall of 1781, Greene had reclaimed almost everything the British had taken in the South, despite having lost most of his major battles. The British were confined to Charleston and Savannah. Cornwallis had marched north to Virginia and gotten trapped at Yorktown, and the Southern campaign, which had been on the verge of collapse when Greene arrived, had become a strategic American victory. Washington knew this. In a letter to Greene after Yorktown, Washington wrote that Greene's achievement in the South was even more remarkable than the victory at Yorktown, which is high praise from a man not known for excessive compliments. And then Greene died in poverty and obscurity. Here's where the story gets sad. After the war, Georgia and the Carolinas gave Greene land as a reward for liberating them from British control. Plantations, specifically. Thousands of acres with enslaved people already working them. Greene, the Quaker who'd been expelled from his meeting for attending military functions, accepted these plantations and became a slaveholder. This is uncomfortable to confront. Greene had fought for American liberty, had risked his life for independence, and then immediately turned around and participated in the enslavement of other human beings. There's no easy way to reconcile these facts. Some historians suggest Greene intended to free the enslaved people eventually, that he had moral qualms about slavery. After his death, his wife Catherine did free some of the enslaved people on their Georgia plantation. But during his lifetime, Greene owned people, and that's a fact we can't ignore or explain away. Greene died in 1786, just 3 years after the war ended. He was only 43 years old. The cause was heat stroke. He collapsed while inspecting his Georgia plantation during summer and never recovered. For a man who'd survived the entire Revolutionary War without serious injury, dying from heat stroke on his own property feels almost absurdly anticlimactic. He was buried on his plantation initially, but here's where things get genuinely weird. His grave was later lost. Not metaphorically lost to history, but literally lost. Nobody could remember exactly where he'd been buried. His remains were moved at some point, possibly to a family vault in Savannah, but the records are confused and contradictory. For over 100 years, there was genuine debate about where Nathaniel Greene's body actually was. It wasn't until 1867 that a monument was erected in Savannah's Johnson Square, and even then it wasn't clear if Greene's remains were actually under it. Modern historians believe he's probably interred in a crypt beneath the monument, but there's still some uncertainty. The man who never lost a supply line during the Revolutionary War managed to lose his own body after death, and he's been largely forgotten. Ask Americans to name Revolutionary War generals, and they'll say Washington, maybe Lafayette, if they're history buffs. Greene, despite being arguably the second most important general of the entire war, is virtually unknown. The Southern Campaign, which he transformed from disaster to victory, gets maybe a paragraph in most textbooks. His tactical brilliance, winning a war by losing battles, is studied in military academies but unknown to the general public. Part of this is because Greene didn't get the Yorktown glory. He wasn't at the dramatic final surrender. He was in the Carolinas, still fighting, still pushing British forces back toward the coast. By the time Cornwallis surrendered to Washington at Yorktown, Greene had already won the South through months of exhausting, unglamorous warfare. But history remembers dramatic moments, not strategic campaigns. Washington got the glory, Greene got forgotten. There's also the uncomfortable reality that Greene's transformation from Quaker pacifist to slaveholding plantation owner doesn't fit neatly into patriotic narratives. We want our founding fathers to be either heroes or villains, not complicated people who did both remarkable and terrible things. Greene was brilliant and hypocritical, brave and morally compromised. He saved the revolution in the South and then became part of the system that denied liberty to others. But the military strategies he developed remain. The idea of winning by exhaustion rather than decisive battle, of preserving your force while depleting the enemies, these became fundamental concepts in American military doctrine. Greene pioneered guerrilla tactics, logistics-focused warfare, and the kind of strategic thinking that values long-term objectives over short-term victories. Modern military strategists still study his campaigns. He was Washington's most trusted general, the man who saved the South, the Quaker who became a warrior. And he died at 43, was buried in a grave that was then lost for a century, and has been almost completely forgotten by the nation he helped create. but the southern states are American because of him. The revolution succeeded in part because of his campaigns, and somewhere under a monument in Savannah probably lies the body of the general who understood that sometimes you win by refusing to lose. And speaking of unlikely heroes who changed the course of the war, let me tell you about the enslaved man who fooled the British and won Yorktown. The enslaved spy who fooled an army. Sometimes the most important victories happen invisibly. While armies clash and generals make dramatic decisions, the real work gets done by people whose names won't appear in dispatches, whose contributions won't be celebrated, whose very existence will be inconvenient to remember. The Revolutionary War had many such invisible heroes, but few as crucial as James Armistead, an enslaved man who posed as a runaway slave loyal to the British, infiltrated enemy headquarters, and fed them false information that directly led to the American victory at Yorktown. His story is remarkable. It's also a story that America tried very hard to forget for a very long time. James Armistead was born into slavery in Virginia around 1748 or 1749. He was owned by William Armistead, a plantation owner in New Kent County. And in 1781, with the war raging through Virginia and both armies desperately seeking intelligence, James did something extraordinary. He volunteered to become a spy. The details of how this happened are murky. What we know is that James approached the Marquis de Lafayette, the young French general who was commanding American forces in Virginia, and offered to infiltrate British lines. Lafayette, who was 23 years old and dealing with a British force twice the size of his own, said yes, and James Armistead became a double agent. Here's how it worked. James would pose as a runaway slave seeking British protection. This was a common occurrence. The British had been offering freedom to enslaved people who escaped from rebel masters and joined their side. Thousands of enslaved people had already fled to British lines seeking liberty. So, when James showed up at British headquarters claiming to be a runaway, willing to help them, nobody questioned it. He was accepted immediately and put to work as a forager and servant. This gave him access to British camps, their supply operations, and most importantly, their commanders. And because he was enslaved, because 18th century racism made white officers assume that Black people couldn't possibly be intelligent enough for espionage, nobody suspected him. James began reporting back to Lafayette. He passed along information about British troop movements, supply levels, and strategic plans. But here's where it gets brilliant. He was also feeding false information to the British. He would tell British officers that Lafayette's forces were stronger than they actually were, that American reinforcements were arriving, that supply depots existed where there were none. The British believed him because, again, they couldn't imagine an enslaved person capable of sophisticated deception. This double game continued for months through the summer of 1781. James became trusted enough that he was assigned to work directly under Benedict Arnold, the American trader who was now commanding British forces in Virginia. Arnold sent James on missions to gather intelligence about American positions. James would go, observe Lafayette's actual dispositions, and then report back to Arnold with complete fabrications while simultaneously giving Lafayette accurate information about British plans. The level of risk here is almost incomprehensible. If James had been discovered, he wouldn't have been treated as a prisoner of war. He was enslaved, operating without any legal protections. Discovery meant torture and execution, and not the relatively quick execution officers might receive. We're talking about gruesome public death designed to terrorize other enslaved people into compliance. But James kept at it. And when Lord Cornwallis took command of British forces in Virginia and began moving toward the coast, James was there, reporting every movement to Lafayette. When Cornwallis decided to fortify Yorktown and wait for reinforcements from New York, James informed Lafayette immediately. And when Washington and the French fleet began their coordinated movement to trap Cornwallis at Yorktown, the intelligence James provided helped ensure the trap worked perfectly. Yorktown ended the Revolutionary War. Cornwallis surrendered on October 19, 1781, and while negotiations dragged on for another year, the war was effectively over. And James Armistead, still enslaved, had played a crucial role in making that victory possible. Lafayette knew this. In testimony he provided later, Lafayette stated clearly that James's intelligence had been essential to the American victory. Without the information James provided, without the false intelligence he fed to the British, Yorktown might not have succeeded. Lafayette praised James's intelligence and fidelity, and confirmed that his service had been invaluable. But here's the thing. Victory didn't mean freedom for James. When the war ended, he was still enslaved. William Armistead, his owner, still owned him. The promises of liberty that had motivated the revolution didn't extend to enslaved people who'd fought for that liberty. James had risked his life for American independence and remained in bondage after it was won. This is where the story becomes a test of persistence. In 1784, James petitioned the Virginia General Assembly for his freedom. He submitted Lafayette's testimony as evidence of his service. He argued that his contributions to the war effort entitled him to liberty. And the Virginia legislature, which was perfectly happy to celebrate abstract concepts of freedom while maintaining slavery, denied his petition. James tried again in 1787. This time, with Lafayette's continued support and more detailed documentation of his service, the petition succeeded. The Virginia General Assembly granted James his freedom. He was approximately 38 years old and had spent his entire life enslaved, including the years when he'd been actively winning the war that secured American independence. As a free man, James took the name James Armistead Lafayette, honoring the French general who'd supported his freedom. He purchased land in Virginia, farmed it, and lived quietly. In 1824, he applied for and received a pension from Virginia for his military service, $40 per year, which wasn't much, but was at least recognition that he'd served. He died in 1830, a free man who'd lived to see some measure of acknowledgement for his contributions, but that acknowledgement was minimal and late. While white Revolutionary veterans got pensions, land grants, and public honors, James had to fight for years just to be freed, then fight again for a modest pension. And after his death, he was almost completely erased from Revolutionary War history. For over 150 years, James Armistead Lafayette's story was barely mentioned in American history textbooks. When the Revolution was taught, it was framed as a story of white patriots fighting for liberty, with enslaved people appearing only as background elements or footnotes. The uncomfortable reality that enslaved people had fought for an American independence that didn't free them was largely ignored. It wasn't until the Civil Rights Movement that historians began seriously recovering these stories. James Armistead Lafayette's contributions were rediscovered, documented, and finally acknowledged. In 1982, over 200 years after Yorktown, the U.S. Postal Service issued a stamp honoring him. Better late than never, I suppose, though the delay itself tells you everything about which stories America chose to remember and which it chose to forget. The truth is that the American Revolution was won by people like James Armistead Lafayette, enslaved people who fought for a freedom they themselves wouldn't receive, who risked everything for a cause that explicitly excluded them from its promises, who demonstrated more courage and commitment to American independence than many of the white patriots who get celebrated in monuments and textbooks. James fooled Lord Cornwallis, Benedict Arnold, and the entire British command structure. He operated the most successful espionage operation of the war. He helped win Yorktown and thereby secured American independence. And for over a century afterward, hardly anyone knew his name. But now, finally, we're starting to remember. starting to acknowledge that American independence was won by more than just the people who signed declarations and commanded armies. It was won by people who weren't even free, who fought anyway because they believed in something better. James Armistead, Lafayette deserves to be remembered alongside Lafayette, Washington, and every other revolutionary hero. Not as a footnote, not as an interesting side story, but as a central figure in the founding of America. And speaking of people whose contributions were erased by prejudice, let me tell you about the Jewish financier who saved the revolution and died bankrupt. The Jewish financier who died owing nothing and owed everything. So, we've talked about Robert Morris, the man who personally financed the revolution and died in debtor's prison. But Morris wasn't working alone. Behind the scenes, helping to broker loans and funnel money to the Continental Congress, was another financier whose story is even more tragic and even more forgotten. His name was Haym Salomon, and he was a Jewish immigrant from Poland who lent the American government somewhere around 650,000 guilders, millions of dollars in today's money, and never saw a penny of it repaid. Actually, it's worse than that. He died bankrupt. His family spent decades petitioning Congress for reimbursement, and the government essentially shrugged and said, "Sorry, the records are unclear," which is a polite way of saying they took his money, won their war, and decided repaying a Jewish immigrant wasn't a priority. But let's start at the beginning, because Haym Salomon's journey to becoming the revolution's invisible financier is remarkable even before you get to the tragic ending. Salomon was born in 1740 in Leszno, Poland, which at the time was part of a region where Jewish people faced constant discrimination and periodic violence. He grew up speaking Yiddish, Polish, and German, later adding French, Italian, and English to his repertoire. By his 20s, he was working as a merchant and broker, traveling throughout Europe, building a network of financial contacts that would later prove invaluable to the American cause. He immigrated to New York sometime around 1772, just a few years before the revolution erupted. Why he came isn't entirely clear from the records, but it was probably the standard immigrant story. Opportunity in America, persecution in Europe, the promise of a place where he could practice his religion without constant fear. New York had a small but established Jewish community, and Salomon quickly integrated himself into both Jewish society and the broader commercial world. When the revolution started, Salomon sided with the rebels immediately. This wasn't an obvious choice for a recent immigrant with no deep roots in the colonies. He could have stayed neutral, protected his business interests, waited to see which side would win. Instead, he joined the Sons of Liberty and started working as a financial agent for the Continental Congress. This caught the attention of the British. In 1776, when the British occupied New York, Salomon was arrested as a spy. The charges were probably accurate. He was almost certainly passing information to the rebels while maintaining his cover as a merchant. But the British didn't execute him. Instead, they put him to work as an interpreter because of his language skills, using him to communicate with their Hessian mercenaries, which was exactly the kind of mistake you make when you assume someone's loyalty based on their usefulness to you. Salomon spent his time as an interpreter convincing Hessian soldiers to desert. He helped prisoners of war escape. He continued passing intelligence to the Americans, and he did it all while technically working for the British, right under their noses. He was arrested again in 1778. And this time the British weren't interested in his language skills. They convicted him of espionage and scheduled him for execution. Salomon escaped. The details are murky, but he somehow got out of British custody in New York and fled to Philadelphia, leaving behind his wife and child. In Philadelphia, Salomon rebuilt his life and his business. He reconnected with his family, who eventually joined him. He established himself as a broker and dealer in bills of exchange. Essentially, he helped people convert different currencies and arrange financial transactions across borders. This was a crucial skill in the 1770s and 80s when there were dozens of different currencies in circulation and no standardized banking system. And then he started lending money to the Continental Congress. Here's how it worked. The Continental Congress desperately needed money, but had no effective way to raise it. They couldn't tax. The Continental dollar was essentially worthless. The states were broke. But they needed to pay soldiers, buy supplies, and keep the war effort functioning. So Robert Morris, serving as superintendent of finance, turned to people like Haym Salomon to help arrange loans. Salomon used his international financial network to broker loans from France and the Netherlands. He advanced his own money when necessary. He helped convert foreign currency into usable funds. He worked essentially as an informal treasury department, keeping the revolutionary government solvent through personal loans and financial expertise. And he did it while charging minimal fees, often taking losses on transactions because he believed in the cause. The amounts were staggering. Estimates vary because the record keeping was, to put it charitably, inconsistent. But Salomon likely lent somewhere between 600,000 and 800,000 guilders to the Continental Congress and to individual patriots like James Madison, who was constantly broke and relied on Salomon's loans to stay in Philadelphia while serving in Congress. Salomon also provided interest-free loans to delegates who were struggling financially. Thomas Jefferson received funds from Salomon. James Madison borrowed repeatedly. Baron von Steuben, the Prussian military officer who trained the Continental Army, got money from Salomon. These weren't small amounts, and they often weren't repaid promptly or at all. But Salomon kept lending because he believed in American independence. He saw the revolution as a fight not just for colonial freedom, but for the kind of religious liberty that had been denied to him in Europe. The promise of America, that you could be Jewish and still be fully American, that religious identity wouldn't limit your citizenship. That promise was worth fighting for, worth investing in, worth risking everything to preserve. He even took out newspaper advertisements offering his services to the Continental Congress, publicizing his willingness to help finance the war effort. This wasn't just patriotism, it was a public declaration that he, a Jewish immigrant, was committed to American independence. In an era when anti-Semitism was casual and pervasive, this was a statement of both belief and defiance. Salomon died on January 6th, 1785, at the age of 44. The cause was likely tuberculosis, though the records aren't definitive. He died suddenly enough that he didn't have time to put his affairs fully in order. And when his family went through his papers, they discovered something devastating. The Continental Congress owed Salomon an enormous amount of money, but the documentation was incomplete and scattered. His widow, Rachel, and his children spent years trying to get reimbursed. They submitted petitions to Congress. They provided what records they had. They appealed to the delegates Salomon had personally helped, asking for testimony about the loans he'd made. And Congress, every single time, found reasons to deny the claims. The records were incomplete. The amounts were unclear. The loans had been made to individuals, not to the government directly, so perhaps those individuals should repay them. The government was broke anyway and couldn't afford to pay old debts. The excuses varied, but the result was always the same: no reimbursement. The Salomon family petitioned Congress in 1791, 1802, 1816, 1846, and 1867. Every time, they were denied. The government that Haym Salomon had helped save couldn't find the resources or the will to repay his loans. His family went from comfortable to impoverished, largely because money that should have been repaid to them was never returned. Salomon was buried in Philadelphia, and his grave bears an epitaph that's heartbreaking in its simple dignity: "To bigotry, no sanction." The phrase comes from George Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, promising that the new American government would give to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. It was a promise that America would be different, that religious minorities would be protected and respected. Salomon believed in that promise. He'd fled European persecution, embraced American independence, and invested everything he had in making that promise real. And in return, America took his money, used it to win a war, and then refused to acknowledge the debt. For over a century, Haym Salomon was barely mentioned in American history textbooks. When the Revolution's financing was discussed, Morris got the credit. When the Founding Fathers were cataloged, Jewish Americans were generally omitted. Salomon's story didn't fit the narrative of Protestant Founding Fathers creating a Christian nation, so it was quietly ignored. It wasn't until the 20th century that Salomon's contributions began to be acknowledged. Historians started piecing together his role in financing the Revolution. Jewish American organizations worked to preserve his memory. And gradually, the man who'd been erased from revolutionary history started to reappear. But the acknowledgement came too late for his family. His descendants never received the reimbursement they were owed. The debt was never repaid. And while there are now monuments to Salomon, while his name appears in some textbooks, the basic injustice of his story remains. He gave everything to help create America, and America gave him nothing in return except broken promises. Haym Salomon's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about who gets remembered and why, about which sacrifices get honored and which get forgotten, about the gap between American ideals and American practice, between the promise of to bigotry no sanction and the reality of how minorities have actually been treated. He was a Jewish immigrant who believed in American freedom enough to risk and lose everything for it. He financed a revolution that promised religious liberty and died, watching that promise remain only partially fulfilled. He deserved better from the nation he helped create. We all deserve to remember his story, incomplete records and all. And speaking of revolutionary heroes whose stories ended in violence and obscurity, let me tell you about the man whose signature is worth $500,000 because he died too soon to become famous. The signature worth $500,000. There's a particular kind of historical irony that's almost too perfect to be true, and Button Gwinnett's story is exactly that kind of irony. He signed the Declaration of Independence, served briefly as Georgia's governor, and then died in a duel at the age of 42, all of which would normally make him a minor footnote in revolutionary history. Except for one weird detail. He died so young and so suddenly that he barely signed anything during his lifetime, which means his signature on the Declaration is now one of the rarest autographs in American history, worth somewhere around $500,000 or more at auction. So Button Gwinnett, and yes, that was his actual first name, Button, given to him by parents who apparently hated him, failed at almost everything during his life, and then became valuable in death through sheer scarcity. It's like being a failed artist whose paintings become priceless because you didn't paint very many of them before dying young. Except instead of paintings, it's signatures. And instead of artistic genius, it's just dying at an inconvenient time. Let's talk about Button Gwinnett's life, which was a series of increasingly poor decisions that somehow ended with him signing one of the most important documents in American history. Gwinnett was born in England in 1735 to a Welsh family. His father was apparently a minister or a merchant. The records are unclear, and his mother decided that Button was an appropriate name for a human child. Whether this was a family name or just a bizarre choice is lost to history, but young Button grew up with a name that must have guaranteed a certain amount of schoolyard misery. He immigrated to America in 1765, settling first in Charleston, South Carolina, before moving to Georgia. He tried being a merchant. That didn't work out. He tried planning, also unsuccessful. He bought an island off the Georgia coast, St. Catherine's Island, and attempted to establish a plantation, which mostly just meant accumulating debts while failing to turn a profit. By all accounts, Button Gwinnett was not particularly good at anything he attempted. He wasn't a skilled businessman, wasn't a successful planner, wasn't wealthy or well connected. He was essentially a minor provincial figure struggling to make something of himself in a colony that was itself struggling to be relevant. But then the revolution started, and suddenly being a mediocre planner in Georgia was enough to get you into politics, because Georgia was desperate for anyone willing to commit to independence. Gwinnett jumped on the revolutionary bandwagon, got elected to the Continental Congress, and in July 1776 found himself in Philadelphia signing the Declaration of Independence. This was, without question, the high point of Button Gwinnett's life. For one brief moment, he was part of history. His name appears on the Declaration alongside Franklin, Adams, Jefferson, and all the other legendary figures. He had achieved something genuinely significant, something that would outlast him. And then he went back to Georgia and immediately started a feud that would kill him. The feud was with Lachlan McIntosh, a Georgia military officer and political rival. The exact details of how it started are complicated and tedious. Something about military appointments and political power struggles and who should be in charge of Georgia's defense. But the basic dynamic was simple. Gwinnett and McIntosh hated each other. Both wanted to be Georgia's leading political figure, and neither was willing to back down. In 1777, Gwinnett was elected president of Georgia, which was what they called the governor at the time. This was his chance to prove himself, to leverage his declaration signer status into a lasting political power. And he immediately used that power to undermine McIntosh, who was commanding Georgia's military forces. Gwinnett ordered a military expedition against British Florida, partly because it seemed strategically useful, but mostly because it would put him in command and diminish McIntosh's authority. The expedition was a disaster. It failed to capture its objectives, wasted resources, and accomplished nothing except embarrassing Georgia and giving McIntosh ammunition to attack Gwinnett politically. When Gwinnett's term as president ended after just a few months, McIntosh publicly accused him of incompetence. Gwinnett responded by accusing McIntosh of treason. The accusations flew back and forth, getting increasingly personal and vicious. And finally, in May 1777, after McIntosh called Gwinnett a scoundrel and a lying rascal during a public assembly, Gwinnett did what any rational person would do. He challenged McIntosh to a duel. Now, dueling in the late 18th century was supposed to follow certain rules. You challenged, seconds negotiated terms, and ideally cooler heads prevailed and everyone went home without shooting each other. But Gwinnett and McIntosh weren't interested in reconciliation. They genuinely wanted to kill each other. The duel took place on May 16th, 1777, just outside Savannah. The terms were deliberately brutal. 12 paces instead of the usual 20 or 30, which meant they'd be shooting from close enough that missing would be difficult. Both men brought pistols. Both men fully intended to use them. They fired simultaneously. Both were hit. McIntosh took a bullet in the thigh, painful but survivable. Gwinnett took a bullet in the groin, which in 1777 was essentially a death sentence. The wound became infected, gangrene set in, and Button Gwinnett spent the next 3 days dying slowly and painfully from a gunshot wound to the pelvis. He died on May 19th, 1777, at the age of 42, having served as Georgia's president for less than 3 months, and having been a signer of the Declaration of Independence for less than a year. His political career was a series of failures, punctuated by one significant achievement. And then he died from a wound that modern antibiotics would have easily treated. McIntosh survived. though he was court-martialed and essentially drummed out of Georgia politics. The duel accomplished nothing except removing Button Gwinnett from history at exactly the moment when he might have become more significant. And here's where the irony becomes almost unbearable. Because Gwinnett died so young, he signed very few documents during his lifetime. Most signers of the Declaration went on to have long political careers, signing hundreds or thousands of documents, letters, and official papers. Gwinnett signed the Declaration, a few Georgia government documents, and then died. His signature is extraordinarily rare. In the 19th century, as autograph collecting became popular, collectors discovered that Gwinnett's signatures were almost impossible to find. One collector spent 40 years searching for a Gwinnett autograph and never found one. Auction houses began listing Gwinnett's signatures as the holy grail of American historical documents, and prices climbed steadily. Thousands in the early 20th century, tens of thousands by mid-century, hundreds of thousands by the 1980s. In 2010, a document signed by Button Gwinnett sold at auction for $722,500, the highest price ever paid for a signature by a founding father who most Americans have never heard of and who accomplished almost nothing during his brief political career. Button Gwinnett is valuable because he's rare, and he's rare because he died stupidly young in a duel over hurt feelings. His legacy is literally his scarcity. He's the founding father equivalent of a misprint on a stamp, worth a fortune not despite being a failure, but because of it. There's something deeply, cosmically funny about this. Gwinnett spent his life trying to achieve significance through politics, military leadership, and public service. He failed at almost all of it. His greatest achievement was showing up in Philadelphia in July 1776 and signing his name. And that signature, which probably took him 10 seconds to write, is now worth more than most Americans will earn in a decade. History is weird like that. It values the strangest things, remembers the oddest details, and sometimes makes heroes out of people for the most arbitrary reasons. Button Gwinnett is remembered not for what he did, but for what he didn't do. Live long enough to sign more things. His story is a reminder that historical significance is often random, that fame can come from failure, and that sometimes dying at the wrong time is exactly what makes you valuable to future generations. Button Gwinnett achieved immortality through scarcity, which is perhaps the most fitting legacy for a man who spent his life failing to achieve it through actual accomplishment. And that brings us to the end of our journey through America's forgotten founding fathers. 10 men who signed declarations, brokered compromises, financed revolutions, won battles, fooled armies, and generally made American independence possible. 10 men who should be household names, but instead got buried in unmarked graves, debtors' prisons, and historical footnotes. Gouverneur Morris wrote "We the People" with one leg. George Mason forced the creation of the Bill of Rights by refusing to sign the Constitution. Caesar Rodney rode 80 miles through a storm while his face was being eaten by cancer. Roger Sherman signed everything and fathered 15 children while doing it. Robert Morris bought a revolution and died in prison. Benjamin Rush bled patients to death while pioneering mental health care. Nathaniel Greene won the South by losing battles. James Armistead Lafayette fooled the British while enslaved. Haym Salomon financed independence and never got repaid. And Button Gwinnett died in a duel and became valuable through scarcity. These are the men who built the foundation that the famous founders stood on. They did the work, took the risks, and paid the prices, and then history forgot to write their names down properly. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember this. American independence wasn't won by the people on the monuments. It was won by the people we forgot to put there. The one-legged diplomat, the stubborn rebel, the midnight rider, the self-taught cobbler, the bankrupt financier, the bloodletting doctor, the brilliant general, the enslaved spy, the Jewish immigrant, and the man with the expensive signature. They made America possible. We just forgot to say thank you. Sleep well. And if you wake up tomorrow in a country with a Bill of Rights and a functioning government, you can thank George Mason and Roger Sherman, even if nobody else does. Sweet dreams.